Welcome to the GE Colloquium in Sustainability Leadership. We're thrilled to have two great panelists here today to discuss corporate water stewardship. I'd like to take a moment to thank GE, the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale, and my classmate Erin Willis for helping make this event possible. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the viewers who are joining us today via the live stream. Our first presenter, Greg Koch, has over 25 years of experience in the environmental and engineering fields. He has a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Columbus College, a Bachelor of Civil Engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology, and a Master's of Science in Civil Engineering, also from the Georgia Institute of Technology. He first joined the Coca-Cola Company in 1996, where he managed the company's wastewater treatment design, construction, and operations program. Greg has been instrumental in driving the company to expand its water focus from technical compliance to taking proactive measures directed toward the sustainability of its business worldwide. Currently, Greg leads the company's Global Water Stewardship. He collaborates with bottling partners, governments, NGOs, and communities throughout the Coca-Cola system and directs his team toward achieving the company's global goal to return to communities and to nature the amount of water equivalent to what is used in all of its beverages and their production, also known as water neutrality. Our second presenter, Jocelyn Cascio, is the Supply Chain, Environmental and Social Governance, or ESG, manager at Intel. Jocelyn works internally and externally to integrate ESG more deeply into Intel's supply chain and to define increased expectations for its suppliers. Jocelyn has spent her entire 17-year tenure at Intel in various roles in the supply chain arena, leading business process improvement and change management efforts on a variety of global initiatives like contingent workforce, e-procurement, and environmental compliance. Jocelyn is a Lean Six Sigma certified black belt with a BA in organizational communication from Arizona State University and an MBA from Babson College. Before I pass things over to the panelists, I would also like to introduce our illustrious moderator for the day. Brad Gentry is a professor in practice here at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He is also co-director at the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale, director of the research program on private investment and the environment. Brad's work explores the opportunities for using private investment to improve environmental performance. His cross-sectoral work focuses on the steps policymakers can take to develop opportunities for sustainable investments, including market frameworks, information systems, and shared investments and partnerships. He has written extensively on the link between private investment and environmental performance, including the book Private Capital Flows and the Environment, Lessons from Latin America. With that, I pass the microphone over to our first presenter, Greg Koch.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to Erin Willis for the initial engagement I had with Yale, and ultimately to all of you and Yale University for allowing me to take part in this. Much appreciated. First of all, I just want to say that your school, the Forestry School, is well represented in the world that I work in. It is quite often that I run into somebody who preceded you in this school, FES, at the World Bank, at other industries, at WWF. In fact, the most remote place I've ever been in all my travels, and I've been to over 100 countries, and most of them many, many times, was in northwestern Mozambique on the banks of Lake Nyasa, Lake Malawi, and met Caroline Simmons, a former graduate of your program here. And she was working for WWF as well as USAID. And so you're well represented, geography-wise as well. So I'm going to walk you through three elements of my presentation. The first is going to be a little bit around the background of water and how we understand it and what are some of the issues. The second is a little bit about how we've developed a strategy and aligned our system to respond to those stresses. And then the third part is going to be just a brief review of the progress that we've made in the execution of that strategy. So the first part, of course, is the stress that water is under, and it is under significant stress. Most people, when they think about that, they start to think about droughts or floods. The big drought in Australia, the water rationing from the drought currently ongoing in Brazil, and of course the big drought in Southern California right now, which is unfortunately going to get worse as the summer comes along. Or they think about floods or very gross contamination, very high levels of contamination. But that is certainly a part of the water stress that the world faces and business and society faces. But as you can see from the list, it's quite an evolved topic. It's a quite involved topic when you look at how water moves through economies, through ecosystems, and how dependent, of course, we all are on water for life. And so when you take a broader view, it is the developed world as well as the developing world that are facing these stresses. We, as the company, those dots you see, you can see it a little bit more clearly here, operate in all but 2 countries. We're not in Cuba and we're not in North Korea. We've got 2 plants in Myanmar, a plant in South Sudan. We run a very local non-export business, but in the context of this presentation, what that does for us is it makes us a canary in the coal mine, if you understand the analogy, in that we're facing these stresses across our business operations and having to respond to them. And so we're seeing the mix of these stresses and the compounding effect of these stresses in developed as well as developing markets. We also, back to that slide at the bottom right, we run one of the largest, or have one of the largest, agricultural ingredient supply chains in the world. When you look at the products that go into our finished beverages, you quickly realize that it's agriculture. So we're the largest buyer of course, all kinds of sweeteners, corn, sugarcane, sugar beet, but all kinds of juices. Number 1, mango, apple, grape, orange, lemon, lime, grapefruit, lots of stone fruits, cherries, apricots, peaches. Huge buyer on the global market and locally, as well as number 2 in the world in tea and in coffee. Number 3. And so when you think about where is water being used in the world, 70-odd% on a global average basis is in agriculture. So these stresses and our response to it get amplified beyond just our direct operations, but into our marketplaces as well as into this vast agricultural ingredient supply chain. And so the way we most commonly experience these stresses, or they manifest themselves, at least in the public realm, is the human health impact. You've probably read the figures, but you have 1 billion people plus that don't have access to safe drinking water. More people have a laptop computer in the world. And you've got 1/3 of humanity, about 2.5 billion people, that don't have access to sanitation facilities. So it's outside is where they go. More people have a mobile phone, a cell phone, than have access to what you would call a porta potty or a latrine or an outhouse, never mind, a fancy restroom or what have you. So there's a huge human health impact, which is constricting, of course, development, education, and contributing to social strife and security and conflict issues. And as I said, this is not just a developing world issue, it's as much a developed world issue. And the issues that we face, some are stark and rising like emerging contaminants, but they typically fall in areas of infrastructure, scarcity, or flood. And so if you've been to Las Vegas and you've seen the Hoover Dam, this is what the Hoover Dam is holding up, is Lake Mead. So huge civil works project, if you've ever been out there. It's the Colorado River flowing through there. Well, this is what it looks like in its upper reaches. A fact that is almost complete now, and they started 5 years ago. The city of Las Vegas is building a tunnel to access the bottom of Lake Mead. because the water exit points for both power generation and the intake points for municipal water supplies are very close to being hung to dry out of the water. And so to ensure from a long-term standpoint the ability to get whatever water is left in Lake Mead, they have built this tunnel and they're almost complete to go under Lake Mead to extract the water instead of trying to have it flow over or beneath the dam. Nashville, Tennessee, this was a 72-year flood. If you understand flood rankings from a zoning standpoint and a stormwater management standpoint, and you could see that a 72-year flood completely trumps the amount of stormwater management they had. So zoning laws, regulations, the amount of pavement have all conflicted with the realities of storm events. This same event well, first of all, in this place, it shut down our business for 2 weeks because the municipal water and sewage facilities, both of them were underwater. We couldn't operate and we were out of business for 2 weeks. That same flood in Atlanta, just show of hands, when I say 72-year flood, 100-year flood, does everyone kind of get that? Okay. The one in Atlanta, we had a similar flooding event like this. It shut down the interstates, much of the city. It took several days for the regulators, for NOAA, for the local weather people, everyone to come back and say, what flood was this? Was it a 500-year, a 1,000-year, a 10,000-year? It was none of those. It was off the charts. It was a flood or a rainfall event, an intensity event, a duration of unprecedented magnitude. So you're starting to see elements of climate change figure into the actual stresses that we already face around water. And of course, this continues. London, I was actually in Hungary when they had this mining tailings pond collapse and the contamination that caused. But when you look at the trend, so what I've said to date is the establishment of lots of water stress that exists today. And these are being exacerbated primarily by 3 factors: population growth, economic development, and of course climate change. And in some places, one of these factors plays in more than the other, but you think about how population is growing. We got more people, and so population will grow faster, somewhere around 9 billion people mid-century, 2050, maybe earlier. A historic rise of people out of abject poverty into the lower middle class, which is a good thing. Think of all the people in India, Brazil, China, Indonesia that have come out of day-to-day subsistence living into the lower middle class. But that's a much more resource-intensive lifestyle. Resources of all kinds, including water. Think processed food, more protein, more manufactured goods, apparel, beverages, yes, what have you. And so that is putting an added resource on already stressed water supplies. And then, of course, climate change adaptation is not about getting used to 2 degrees centigrade warmer temperatures as much as it is a much different, unpredictable situation with regard to water. So this is my favorite slide that pulls those 3 together. This is a water park in Sichuan province in south central China. And so what are you seeing here? Well, you're seeing population growth. There's, 1 billion plus people in China. You're seeing economic development. A dirt poor farmer anywhere in the world cannot afford to go to a water park. And so it's a National Geographic slide, but I love putting it together because you could, sort of imply it's hot, climate change, so it speaks volumes. A bit of humor is I love the guy whose daughter or son convinced him to bring that little alligator, thinking they would be able to float around in this big pool around that. But anyway, I mean, that's the reality of what a rising income level does, as well as population growth. You put a lot of stress on resources that are stressed to begin with. And so what that leads to is it's not going to change the water equation in the world. There's a fixed amount of water, just like there's a fixed or finite amount of oil or coal, but water is unlike those in that it's infinitely renewable, of course. But what will change is the rate of those stresses over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And so here's a slide that comes from our modeling, and all of this you can find even more updated and more comprehensive in the World Resources Institute's Aqueduct Water Risk Management Program. And there's some people here from that program. But that rate of change, so think about a meter sea level rise. If that meter sea level rises in 1,000 years, well, that gives species, human and otherwise, and ecosystems time to adjust. But if you get a meter sea level rise in 10 years, that's a whole different rate of change. And so human species, economies, societies, whatever, do not adapt well to rapid rates of change. And so we're amplifying existing stresses in a very short time frame, which is going to exacerbate the problems that we already have. So that's a little bit about water and sort of the macro view. So what does it mean for us? And the most important point on this slide is the last point. We're a non-export business. So I mentioned 1,000 manufacturing plants in all but 2 countries. Well, we're not making a car in Mexico to ship to Detroit. We're not getting an education at Yale University to then go out into the world, right? Those are different business models, and they work for Yale and for GM and Ford. They work for other beverage companies. Think of where your wine and premium beers come from, alcohols, most processed food. There's a handful of places around the world, pharmaceuticals, and then the finished products are shipped around the world. Our business model doesn't work that way. The price point that our beverages sell at and the business model that we found most successful is local ownership, manufacturing, sourcing, and distribution. And so when you take those operations, our response from a water standpoint is not about we need to get enough water for our operations. It's, yes, we need water of sufficient quantity and quality, but we have to understand and play a role, a positive role, in the broader watershed and communities that we're a part of because they are our marketplace. It's who we're selling our product to. So this transcends corporate social responsibility, and it's not embedded in our structure, the way we execute our strategy on water. It is a business imperative, a material risk. And so it is, yes, altruistic in some senses, the work that we do. It is a positive benefit, to society, but it's all driven from a fundamental business model and a business risk, which makes our response to those issues very sustainable. So as long as we have a business, we're going to play a very positive role in helping societies that we're a part of, these communities and the watersheds we share with them, to have enough water. Speed up a bit. The risk assessment that we conducted, so we came out of this realization, this has been an evolution, a maturity, if you will, of understanding at the very local level these water stressors and how they are changing and being amplified over time. We then made it relevant to our business in terms of understanding our supply chain, our manufacturing process, and our non-export business model. So that gave us the relevance. But neither of those are actionable. You know, it's like going to the doctor and saying, okay, I've got my checkup and I've got my blood pressure and all my blood work, and it's a report card. You have to develop a deeper understanding of the actual risks that you face from that data set to be able to develop a strategy. So the next step of our journey was to do a very comprehensive risk assessment, to develop ideas of event initiators, their probabilities and frequencies, consequences, and ultimately impact, which is what you do every day. I like using the personal health care analogy because you do that, right? You get your doctor report and you sort of think, well, maybe I ought to lower my blood pressure. And why? Because I could have a heart attack. Well, what's bad about that? I could die. I could have a stroke and have my lifestyle and earning potential diminished, my quality of life. You do it really quickly. You do it every time you cross the street. You do a formal risk assessment. What's the likelihood, consequences, impact? And you decide to cross the street or speed or run that stop sign. So it's something we all do on a routine basis, but when you quantify it and do it more rigorously, which business does all the time, we apply that same methodology to water. and it identified at the plant level, at a very granular level, the specific risks that we're finding, which helped us develop a strategic response to that. So these are the broad global roll-up of that type of work, but we could pull that down to a square kilometer resolution in terms of the data that we put together to be able to do this. And that lets us now develop a strategy. So now we have this. So back to the human healthcare analogy. Okay, so now I got my report. I've done a risk assessment. What am I going to do about it? Well, I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to stop smoking. I'm going to take some medication, exercise, what have you. I've got a strategy, and ultimately I might set some goals for responding to that risk or mitigating that risk. And this is, the next 3 slides are the 3 most important from my perspective, because they explain in a nutshell our overall approach. So this strategic response said, yes, we have to work in our upstream ingredient supply chain, and of course in our own operations on water management, efficiency, wastewater treatment, runoff, all those types of issues, but that we have to extend that type of understanding and response to the watersheds that we share, to the communities that we're a part of, and then ultimately on a broader stage at the policy level and in the general education and awareness level. So that's the strategy. And once we had that strategy and spent enough time on capacity building, we were able to set goals, and this slide marks progress against those goals. The first 2 being around water efficiency and wastewater management in our business. The next 2 being about a quantification of how we're progressing and mitigating that risk. So think of that as going back for a checkup and seeing how your blood pressure is doing. And then this concept of replenish, which you heard in the introduction, and I'll spend a little bit of time on, and we'll talk about it in the panel discussion afterward. But I want to say that all this was possible because of the capacity building. So this speaks to academia and to education. We had to develop a skill set across our business for plant level people, supply chain managers, business managers, finance managers, a broad swath of cross-functional teams to be able to execute that strategy at the tactical level. So we needed to build capacity on partnerships, partnership formation, stakeholder identification and engagement, of course the science, social and conservation science around water issues. So what we ended up doing is developing a training program, and it's online. It can be self-paced, it can be facilitated classroom styles. It has it takes all those topics, from policy to community engagement to hydrology to geochemistry, whatever the case may be. A very broad swath of topics that are relevant to this. And there's 3 levels of education. I like to call them sort of the bachelor's, master's, and PhD level. And you choose what level per what topic based on your role and responsibility in the organization, as well as the amount of risk that you're facing. And we have some guidance to help people go through that. It's in 7 different languages, and we've done well over 100,000 different training modules that have been scored, and people have gone through that process. And that is part of the governance that we have around our source protection program to build that capacity. So that was the last step. It was this huge education effort over a period of 4 years. Again, back to the healthcare analogy. Okay, so you want to lose weight, you want to improve your diet, and that's part of your strategy based on your risk assessment. Well, you've got to go talk to a dietitian and understand nutrition better. You have to join a gym and learn how to use the machines, and hopefully can get coordinated enough to do aerobics, which I can't do. So it follows along in a very logical fashion that's the next step. And a lot of these happen somewhat in parallel, but the importance I want to point out here is the humongous investment we made and continue to make and sustain in capacity building within our business system. So now that you know what the risks are and strategically how to respond, and you've built some capacity, you have to decide, what am I specifically going to do? And of course, in every situation, there's a whole range of options, and this is only a partial list. This doesn't get into municipal infrastructure and leak detection and management, safe water access, policy engagement, awareness raising. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. And this is a simplified version of the model that we use to help make that decision on what to do. We have some form of, or level and detail of data, of knowledge of the risks that we're facing. So there's a collective, I'm sorry, I use my hands too much. There's a collective understanding of that then points to the underlying driver of that risk. And it's typically going to be a combination of something in those several boxes that you see there, but something around ecological health as well as human health, or a mix of those, that then allow us to point to specific activities that will help address those. And those are the four broad categories. Under education and awareness, you could add policy. Policy engagement is sort of the fastest growing part of our response work to risk mitigation. And in the course of that, this is the last part of the presentation, had some progress. You saw some on the progress slide in terms of the goals that we've set and how we're progressing against those. But another way of looking at it is this concept of replenish. And so there we are tying the quantitative impact of all the projects that we do in communities, in watersheds, whatever the case may be, to our product volume. And we're doing that not to sort of say that's all we have to do, but it is an easy way to convey to people the progress that we're making. And it's a goal that we'll never attain. Never attain in the sense that we could reach 100%, but the minute we sell more product, we have to maintain that level of 100% replenish. So as our business grows organically or by acquisition, or if a project that we executed falls out of productive service, we have more to do. So it's a self-serving goal in that you have to reach and maintain it, and we're about halfway there, but then you have to attain it, but then you have to maintain it as your business grows and as those projects need to be sustained. And in the course of doing that, I think this is the third big important slide that I talked about is the need for partnerships. And a lot of my role is away from my roots in technical and engineering and whatnot, but it's working with governments, communities, and in all cases through partnerships. These are some of our bigger partnerships that myself and my team manage, but we're not an NGO. We're not an aid and development agency. We are not the government. And so when we step outside the four walls of our plant and want to engage on those types of issues, we have to do that openly, transparently, and in partnership. Thank you.
Hi, and I'll start with adding my thanks as well for inviting us here today to participate in this forum. Very happy to be here. I'm actually based at our Massachusetts facility just west of Boston. And as mentioned in the intro, my background is really in supply chain management. So I have one slide on that, but we'll cover the overall corporate water strategy information here to begin with and then wrap up with supply chain. I assume many of you are familiar with Intel. We've got about 100,000 employees at this point spread across the globe, and our major manufacturing sites are here on this map. So the red dots are our wafer fabs. So that's where you will see the majority of our water use, because that's very specifically tied to the cleaning of the silicon wafers during the manufacturing process. The white dots are where we have assembly and test facilities, so those tend to be lower water use sites. Broadly speaking, when we look across the globe at all of our water usage, and that currently stands at about 9 billion gallons a year right now. I'll talk more about that in another couple of slides. About 80% of what we use is currently sent back to the local water sources where it can be reused. And again, I've got more detail on that, but big picture-wise, about 80% is essentially sent back to the municipalities where we operate. The 45 billion number is actually a little out of date. We're closer to 50 billion at this point in terms of what we've been able to save through a variety of programs. Again, I'll share some details in the past decade or so. And our spending on water programs is well over $100 million at this point and growing. So we've also set a goal, a little bit of a tie to what Greg shared for Koch. By 2020, we're looking to get back down below our normalized per chip water usage numbers from 2010. So both our absolute and our normalized usage has been increasing over the past several years. That's tied to the increasing complexity in the fabrication process. So as our technology moves forward, what comes with that is a lot of additional, typically rinsing of the silicon wafers. So again, we feel this is a very aggressive goal, yet at this point, we are on track and we feel it's realistic through additional focus and investments. So Intel's about a 45-year-old company, and this whole notion of embedding and integrating and having a strong water strategy is one that's really been around from the beginning. So the statement at the top is from our chairman at the time, Gordon Moore, and this was from '95, so this was our actually first annual environmental report that we published. And this was right around the time where we were really starting to grow our manufacturing operations in places like Arizona and Israel, right, which again we'll talk more about as I move along. So certainly not a new notion that we really need to consider and integrate water as well as other environmental variables as we grow our operations. The bottom quote is from last year's CSR report, our outgoing CEO, Paolo Ottolini, again, really reinforcing that executive commitment to ongoing responsibility. We just, in terms of kind of culturally at Intel, we really look at very broadly environmental, social, and governance factors typically under one umbrella. So, you know, we're here obviously specifically to talk about water, but I just want to point out that, again, social issues in general, governance, ethics topics, those all tend to be looked at very holistically when we look at our operations and where we want to continue to improve. Okay, so a couple of facts. That is just a point of comparison there. One of our Ivy Bridge chips, even that being a couple of years old at this point, roughly the size of a grain of rice. And in terms of the numbers of transistors and how fast those are able to compute, it's just to kind of give an appreciation for the pace of the technological advancement and the scale, the very small scale at which all of this is happening. So ultimately, as the technology increases, one of the biggest impacts is actually the energy conservation, the reduction in energy that it takes, relatively speaking, for that increased amount of computing power. So that's something that I think the ICT industry as a whole can have probably the most significant impact on, beyond our own operations, beyond our supply chain efforts. As an industry with that energy efficiency, we can really enable massively greater end results and impacts, whether it's water, electricity, or otherwise. So, okay, so couple of points on our overall approach to water over the years. So again, corporate commitment from the top level for many years. I'll actually briefly show our water policy, which we updated most recently in 2010. We also have done pretty comprehensive water footprinting over the past several years. I have some more details to share in the next couple of slides. We have done a lot locally at those fab sites around the globe, especially the ones where we're talking about deserts like Arizona. Again, I'm going to share some more of that. The site selection process very much considers not only water, but again, all environmental factors. So as we decide where the next fab is going to be, this is really something that is truly top of mind. And I'll talk about how we make some of those decisions and what we look at. Again, the 2020 goals I've mentioned already. And then continuous improvement. So as an engineering company, this is really something that's part of our DNA. No matter really what department you're in, whether it's technical or non-technical, there is this very data-driven, very, I'll say, commitment to always looking to improve. And that certainly extends to our work in water as well. Greg mentioned some of their external partnerships and collaborations. We do a lot of that. Also, a couple of these are mentioned here, and I hope these slides are made available because a lot of these are links, and be happy to share more on that afterwards. And then transparency, again, another theme that Greg brought up. So really making sure that we are being as open as possible publicly, engaging with shareholders, NGOs, local and national governments. This Explore Intel website is kind of interesting. This has been out for a couple of years. If anyone's familiar with some of the environmental challenges we've had at our New Mexico facility, Rio Rancho, was actually created largely in response to some of our neighbors' concerns in that Rio Rancho area about some of our factories' emissions. So what this Explore Intel site has grown to be is essentially real-time data monitoring, including cameras that sit on the roofs of all of our manufacturing facilities around the globe at this point, with real-time readings on factory emissions. So if you were wondering what our Dalian, China facility was emitting right now, you could pull it up and see that data and see a view of those stacks at on the factory roofs real time. So that's something that we've done, I think, to really, because we really do value and understand that transparency is critical, not only for us, but for a lot of our stakeholders. Okay, this is not intended to be read. It's a bit of an eye chart, but again, the link's here, so feel free to peruse it. But again, this is our current water policy, very deeply embedded. Again, you'll see reference to the Intel Code of Conduct, our supplier code of conduct. All of this is very, very embedded across our operations. Okay, here's a peek at our current water footprint. So as I mentioned, current usage as of end of year 2012, we're just finishing the 2013 calculations, but 2012 usage was at about 9 billion gallons annually. This flow is intended to just show, obviously, where that goes and where we're able to either reuse, replenish, or recycle along various parts of the flow. So we've been water footprinting now for the past 3 years. We've engaged with Qantas over the past 2 years to really try to, again, bring some external stakeholder perspective and expertise to our footprinting, and also to make sure that we're really able to prioritize and drive our next round of continuous improvement based on some really extensive external expertise as well. So we've published a couple of IEEE papers, one co-authored with Qantas over the past couple of years that are out there, and the most recent one actually diving a little bit more deeply into scope 2 and 3 water usage as well. So this is included in our annual CSR report. Again, another key way we try to be transparent and share what's going on with our stakeholders. Okay, another bit of an eye chart, but this is what has come from the 2012 engagement, again, with Qantas. So the idea here is, again, recognizing the fact that we've got operations in a lot of arid locations around the globe, really trying to get our arms around the true impact of having fabs in those areas. So the first column is very straightforward. It's just the volume of water used. The second is based on the water stress index, and the idea is that we can better understand the potential for impacts in these locations where we have these fabs using large volumes of water. Columns 3 and 4 are really more detailed and based on very specific local pressures and local issues in the communities where these fabs are located. So daily is disability adjusted life years, and the values here help us to determine where we need to take more action. So The value here doesn't necessarily mean that Intel's operations are driving or the only factor in this potential impact, but it does help us figure out when and where we need to do more. So Vietnam is an example with the 19 value. We knew going into that facility, and that's our newest assembly test facility. It's been operational for just a couple of years. We knew we had to do more engagement there before we brought up our operations. So the high-tech park where our site is located, we actually did a lot on the ground to make sure that the overall infrastructure was improved sufficiently before we started operating, so that once we got there, we didn't have to have any unpleasant surprises. So again, site selection looked at this very early on, and we were able to proactively work with the local government and our neighbors in that high-tech park to make improvements. I was actually just there about a month ago. And early in January, the Wall Street Journal did an article recognizing specifically the Vietnam site as being a really strong, really role model in terms of the overall sustainability of the site. So I know that was a really big deal, and site management was, very, very pleased to see that, again, being proactive had ultimately resulted in what we had hoped, and that is avoiding some of the potential issues. Okay, so this is an Arizona case study. So Arizona typically is what we get asked about the most. So whether it's during one of our socially responsible investor roadshows that we do every year, or just through ongoing NGO or other stakeholder dialogue, Arizona tends to be what people ask about. So we've got 3 fabs there now. And generally, without any actions taken, what we would essentially withdraw from that City of Chandler source is 8.9 million gallons a day. So this is just that standard picture. If we did nothing, this is what it would look like at our operations in Arizona. However, since about 1996, we've had a really good program in place, again, that's been continuously improving. But we engaged with the City of Chandler. So Chandler's the town in Arizona where all of these fabs reside. And over these years, we've actually been able to conserve and put back into the aquifer over 5 billion gallons of water through this program with the city. So essentially, Intel funded the development of an RO wastewater plant, and again, worked with them to initially, just with that particular effort, reduce our demand by about 1.1 million. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 15, maybe 20% reduction. Then we've been able to use reclaimed water. So beyond the aquifer recharge piece of it, we've been able to utilize over 4.5 billion gallons of treated wastewater from Chandler to cool in the cooling towers, run the scrubbers in the factory, and also for the landscaping, which obviously in the desert does still, even with desert landscaping, require some amount of irrigation. So that took us down by about another 1.9 million. And then lastly, through internal reclaim and recycling, we're able to further reduce our need by about another 1.1 million. So lots of projects on an ongoing basis that not only come from some of the technical experts that you might expect to be working on this kind of thing, but we actually have some really cool employee programs that are just widely available to anyone who has an idea for a sustainability project. So we've got some sustainability in action grants that anyone from any department can apply for if they've got a proof of concept that they want to explore, or a pilot that they'd like to get off the ground that they think can help make an impact environmentally. So those have been really increasing in terms of how many employees are applying every year, the impact of the projects and the results that they're getting. So we see, people from the finance organization, or from human resources, or from IT getting together with manufacturing folks, site and facilities management folks, and putting together these teams just to apply for these grants and ultimately end up driving a lot of what results in these pretty big numbers in the end. So that's been pretty exciting to see. So in the end, in Arizona, based on the variety of efforts over the years, we are able to reduce our usage by roughly 50%. Supply chain, the piece I'm most familiar with. Again, we look at, as I mentioned, ESG criteria kind of all together. And we've really had that fully integrated into our supply chain management practices for quite a number of years now. So as an example, all suppliers in their integrated scorecard are assessed on how they're doing in this area. And that absolutely includes water as a specific requirement. Contract terms and conditions, our supplier recognition program, all of these we've been able to integrate sustainability over the past several years. Our top suppliers, so we have a group of about 300 suppliers with which we spend probably about 90% of our dollars every year. We're very specific with them in terms of having to have multi-year water waste and carbon goals and measurable progress towards those. And again, if they don't, that's going to be reflected on their scorecard, and future business decisions are going to be based on that alongside other criteria. And then I don't know, how many here have heard of the EICC, Electronics Industry Citizenship Coalition? One or two hands. This is about a 10-year-old coalition that Intel helped found together with Microsoft, IBM, HP, Dell, a lot of the big players in the industry. It's grown to almost 90 member companies today, representing every tier of the electronic supply chain, going all the way back to small components manufacturers and all the way forward to retailers like Best Buy. And I think the key thing, as with most industry associations, is really trying to drive some standards here. So within the EICC Code of Conduct, we have very specific environmental expectations embedded there. And that means when we go to audit our high-risk suppliers, we're asking about a lot of this in a lot of detail. So whether it's wastewater treatment, water conservation efforts, every time we have a third party go and perform a supplier audit, that's being looked at all over the globe. So it's another way, I think, that represents the overall integration. So what have we learned, again, over these past several decades, and where are we today? I think being proactive and open-minded has been obviously top of the list here. I think the New Mexico example I mentioned earlier, where we did for a number of years have some challenging conversations with some of our neighbors. I think we learned a lot from that. And I think that we continue to try to, again, keep an open mind anytime it's a new challenge that we come upon. Leveraging existing literature and experts. Again, that continuous improvement culture that really permeates everything we do. Transparency, again, clearly a key driver. And then make sure we're staying in touch. So we don't want to let that footprinting activity sit for a couple of years, right? We know things are changing at a very fast pace, whether that's our own internal operations or externalities. So really trying to not wait and just try to stay as ahead and be as proactive as possible. So thank you. My contact information here, as is Tom Cooper's. He's actually our true global water strategy lead and expert. So he is available as well. And then our CSR report's linked here. There's a lot out there if you wanted some additional details. Thanks. Okay.
So thank you both very much, and look forward to a nice amount of time for questions. What I thought we'd do is I'd ask a couple of questions to get started and then open it up to questions from the audience. One of the things that struck me as you were talking was to maybe dive a little bit deeper into some of the business case aspects for the investments of time and money that have been made. You know, thinking about financial returns and brand returns and other sorts of social or other returns. So, Greg, I might start with, you know, you all, as a part of the replenishment goal, are not just doing things at your plant, you're not just doing things in your supply chain, you're reaching out to organizations in your watersheds. How do you about determining how far to go? You know, how many organizations to link with, sort of watershed by watershed?
Very good question. And we talked a little bit about it at lunch for those that were there. Water is the ultimate public good. And so at the end of the day, the scale at which water moves through an economy, a society, and the integration of water in everything that humans do makes it this ultimate public good, and therefore it is government who ultimately need to step in and set policy and then enforce that policy all the way down to regulations and codes and what have you. So that's why I mentioned in our strategy the fastest growing part of our work is that policy engagement, which we do collectively and very transparently, which you really have to do because of fears of policy capture. So that's the ultimate long-term play, but in executing the specific strategies at the plant level, we use 3 measures to sort of tell us how far to go. The first is inherent in the goal that we set in Replenish, and so the work will be quantified in terms of its beneficial impact, and every business unit, every geographic grouping and operation in our system has a goal to reach. Some are more than 100%, some are less, depending on the local needs and stresses. And so how much you progress against Replenish is one way to value and gauge how far you need to go. The second, and arguably well, they're all important. Depends on when you ask me. Another important measure of how far to go is risk mitigation. So when you do risk mitigation, you have a target. You have a quantification of that risk. Again, in the healthcare example, it's the value of your life and the quality of life that you have, your earning capacity, what have you. The same happens in the type of risk assessment that we did. And so when you repeat that, you can actually do a cost-benefit analysis on the resources you've expended against the amount of risk that you've mitigated. And so if you trust your original numbers, like you trust your doctor, you're going to do things and you know when to stop. And then the last is about, and it's the hardest one, and it probably, this is the most important one. It's our licenses to operate. And it's sort of a reflection of all that came before it. And it's probably our biggest learning, certainly my personal biggest learning when it comes to water. We need 3 licenses to operate wherever we or our supply chain uses water. And the first is the regulatory license. And that is what you think it is. It's the permits, the abstraction license, the fees, the contracts, whatever you have. So that's one measure. If I'm maintaining that, that's one measure of how far I need to go. The second is the physical license. And there is the hydrology, the hydrogeology, the sustainable supply of enough clean water for you and your marketplace, right? And so sometimes that's utopian in thinking, but that's a way to go. And then the last is the emotional license. And I say that versus the social license because water actually goes beyond sort of the construct of the social license to operate because of how connected we are with water, spiritually, physically, religiously even. So that social acceptance of our use of water and the political will to support it wrapped up in that emotional license. And so it's securing and maintaining those 3 licenses. It is the risk mitigation benefit and the Replenish progress as the proxies for how far to go.
Great. So Jocelyn, as you thinking about your example of having the water needed for the plant in Arizona, did all of those investments have to meet the same hurdle rate as all of the investments in the company? Or do you have sort of special lower hurdle rates if there are these public benefits or the emotional license to operate type of issues that are out there?
Yeah, great question. So first I'll just say our view on the license to operate piece is pretty consistent, right? That it's a complex scenario, not as simple as kind of the permitting process. But generally speaking, where we'll typically be a little more generous is in the ROI timeframe. So not so much in, funding a lot that's negative ROI, but more, say, for example, allowing up to a 10-year time frame versus something operationally that might need to be more in a 3 to 5 type of year. And that's not a hard and fast rule, but when we look at things like those sustainability and action grants, when we look at some of our renewable energy purchases, that's something that we will typically take a little bit longer term view on.
Nice. So maybe one last round, and then I'll open it up for questions, and there'll be microphones going around. So you've both got these wonderfully ambitious targets, for Coca-Cola, water neutrality by 2020, for Intel, we're taking your per chip water use back to 2010 by 2020. What are the biggest barriers to achieving those? Maybe we start with Greg.
Oh, sure. The biggest barrier for us, early days, I would have said alignment with our system. But the way we went through this process of, similar to the presentation that I gave, of discovering or learning about the water stresses and then developing a strategic response and then executing that, made that alignment possible across our business system. So when I say we, I'm talking about our franchise bottling partners as well as the company's operations on a global basis, because we all share the same brand, even though they may not report up through Atlanta and the Coca-Cola Company. But that was a significant factor in planning for the future, is that internal alignment, which came from that co-discovery and co-development of both the underlying data and the strategic response to that. The biggest challenge, I think, going forward is around collective action and public policy. I don't see the big challenge being in us attaining our goals. We do apply the same internal rate of return pegged to cost of capital thresholds for our work, and we can quantify that against our risk assessment. And we've been successful to date. So I'm confident that we'll reach our goals. It'll be a challenge maintaining that level going forward, but us meeting our goals isn't going to solve the water crises that exist in all these places. And so the bigger challenge is, how much more do you do? Because you may have made your impact sustainable or positive in that sense, but that hasn't mitigated the overall stress in a given watershed. And so the big challenge is going to be how to build a consensus from a broader set of actors, industry as well as government and civil society, to amplify the type of work that we're doing.
Do you mind if I just ask a follow-up on that? So you talk about building the political consensus, essentially, and the policy framework. Is that going to need to be done watershed by watershed, or is there something that can usefully be done at the global level or a regional level or other thing like that?
At the end of the day, you need to do it on the sub-basin level, and that's where people experience water issues. That's where they interact with water, and for the most part, that's where it's regulated. So you have to fill the data gaps at the sub-basin level. So if you're in Connecticut, you don't really care how much water is in the United States, or even in Connecticut, you care if you live in New Haven how much is here, and the local municipality, I'm certain, has a lot of control on that, and so that makes it take more time. But those global data sets and even country level are great to get started and identify hotspots, but you've got to fill that in at a very local level. Particularly when the most powerful way we find is to engage in this policy discussion is to analyze and discuss how water moves through an economy in its widest sense, from tourism to actual productive uses of water, what have you, transportation, navigation, making Coca-Cola beverages or Intel chips, what have you. And when you do that, then you have a franker discussion, more candid one, with all the stakeholders on the choices of what you do with the water that you have and how you manage that. And so putting it in something we all share, and that's the value of water. We may not fully appreciate it, but we certainly have it. And then everyone cares about finances and their livelihood and their well-being. And that makes manageable to get started versus throwing your hands up and saying, yeah, I just can't go that far, it's too detailed.
So if you need it sub-basin by sub-basin, that's a lot of jobs. So our students should be sending you lots of CVs, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Jocelyn, how about for you and your biggest barriers?
So I think first and foremost, it really is often a technology challenge for us. So we work with industry associations like Sematech and SIA to try to really collaborate and work, for example, with our capital equipment suppliers. So those multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment that go out onto our factory floors, a lot of times those suppliers need to be very involved with making that equipment more efficient, right? Using less water, again, for the rinsing of the wafers as they go through the manufacturing process. So we do work with suppliers on an individual basis, but then through the industry associations, really try to drive non-competitive advancements so that it's not a matter of just creating, a competitive advantage when one company is able to make progress and another isn't, but to try to really collaborate and realize the benefits for the industry as a whole. So that's one way as far as the technology challenge goes that we try to approach it. And then it is a cost issue as well. So again, sometimes that is helped by the industry-wide efforts. I want to share, though, that we've been getting a lot more creative and open-minded internally than we ever have been in the past since setting those 2020 goals. So our technology development factory, which is in Portland, Oregon, for the first time with our couple generations out of manufacturing processes that are in development now, have been much more willing to consider options as far as water goes that have always been off the table in the past. So I can't really share the details on that, but those are some of the reasons why we do feel that that very aggressive 2020 goal is still realistic and achievable. So internally, things that were previously sacred cows that we would never talk about considering are now on the table, being piloted, and ultimately, hopefully, making it to high-volume manufacturing processes. So that's been pretty encouraging.
It's interesting the difference there between the technology barriers and the more political or social barriers over time. So maybe I'll open it up to questions. I've got a microphone here and a microphone there. There's one in the front. If people could wait for the mic to show up and then briefly state your name and your organization so that the people watching the live stream will know who's asking the question.
Thanks. I'm Tom Wheel. I'm with Water Health, which is one of the Koch partners. And there's huge overlap here between what you guys are trying to do, which is incredibly hard. And maybe you want to spend a minute just telling people about how tough it is in the basin and on the ground to get these things done. But one of the frustrating elements of opposition comes from NGOs, many of whom don't appreciate the role that capital can play in solving these problems, and governments who have turf issues. And any comments you have on how you deal with those, I'd be interested in. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'll take the second part first, and turf issues. I can fully understand and appreciate how that is a challenge for a lot of businesses, and I can't say that we've cracked the code on that. But when you look at our business model again, I always go back to that because of how foundationally important that is. We're a local business. We're the largest private employer in Africa, for instance. We're the fourth largest employer in the world. And so all those truck drivers, all those people working at the plants, that's where most of those are. They're all locals, as is the general management and the marketing manager and the supply chain manager. So we are an integral and long-standing partner in those communities. We routinely engage with government, civil society, schools, what have you. And so I wouldn't say this is just an automatic progression, but it is an extension of the types of relationships that we already have there. We still run into that, but we never go it alone. We don't go in as the Coca-Cola Company to say, this is what I think you ought to do on water policy. We look for platforms and partners to join us. Most notably is our main thrust in the policy realm at the country level is through a group called the 2030 Water Resources Group, or WRG. And it's housed in the IFC. And it's a multi-stakeholder platform of that type of engagement at the country level. Well, who's a member of that? Yes, we are. So is PepsiCo. This is a pre-competitive issue for us. So Nestle's in there, SAB Miller. You know, we'll compete on the marketplace shelf, but sustainable communities, starting with sustainable water systems and how you manage them and resources, is pre-competitive. And so we're right there in other industry associations actually working with Intel. So that gets a little bit at the turf issues and ameliorates that concern a little bit, that you're not coming in to capture policy for your own purposes, and you can really demonstrate that when you walk in with your chief competitor. How hard is this? It is difficult. Jennifer Hoyle, I don't know if she's in here, but she was earlier, I met with her. You know, what I told her is that the soft stuff is the hard stuff. So unlike the technology that you need to achieve what you do in your business model, I mean, there's a role for that in our work, but that's not the crux of it, right, in us meeting our goals. And it's not really the crux of solving most of the world's water problems. That's the hard stuff. The hard stuff, the more difficult thing to do, is the soft stuff. It is policy engagement, behavior change, capacity building, developing finance networks, developing a supply chain, sustainable incomes. You know, that type of engagement over 3,000 communities where those 468 projects are being executed, that's the challenging but also the very rewarding work.
Jessalyn, maybe you could focus in on the NGO side and the sort of range of experiences you all, I'm sure, have had with NGOs and lessons learned from that.
Yes, that's what I was thinking, actually.
Excellent.
So sometimes NGOs can certainly be collaborative, but not always. So we do a couple of things to try to have as collaborative relationships as possible. So we do try to, again, be open even to sitting down with some that come in with very adversarial, whether it's with a shareholder resolution or otherwise, and really have an open dialogue, try to come to some common ground, and just try to be willing to work with, even if, you know, on the surface it appears that, you know, priorities are very different or, you know, perspectives are very different. We do materiality assessments on a regular basis and really try to pull in lots of NGOs, not just the ones that we know to be business friendly that we have ongoing relationships with. So we work with BSR a lot. On a lot of initiatives, we'll pull them in, but we'll also pull in others that aren't necessarily always at the top of our list for, you know, wanting to engage with. So in that way, we really try to make sure that their voices are heard, that we're bringing in a really broad range of perspectives and taking those into account in that big picture assessment of what our external stakeholders' priorities are. And then I briefly mentioned the SRI roadshows that we do every year. So again, that's not NGOs, but just engaging with that additional very important group of stakeholders. I think it's been almost 10 years or so that we do a tour every fall, DC, New York, and Boston. I've been part of those meetings for the past 3 years, where we sit down after our CSR report comes out every year. We go into quite a bit more detail and really try to get their feedback. And trust me, some of them are very vocal, very frank, and not shy about, you know, telling us where, you know, hey, this isn't enough. We've certainly heard that water concerns raised in those conversations. So those are very open, candid dialogues that I think we also feel are very sincerely important to really balancing priorities and understanding where those external stakeholders are coming from.
Hi, I'm Laura Slavin, second year at the Yale School of Management. Thank you both for being here. You both come from organizations that are very advanced with respect to water stewardship, and I wonder how you balance the need to gain competitive advantage with the need to collaborate and move your industries forward to solve the world's water problems. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, from the Coca-Cola standpoint, it's rather straightforward. It is a pre-competitive issue. So when we look at our business model, again, back to that, but we look at the stresses that a watershed, a community, a marketplace faces. They're the same ones that our operations there face. Our response cannot be unilateral because we're not the government. We don't own the watershed. We're not an NGO. So we have to partner with those elements. But at the end of the day, we have to work with other industry, share our data and our knowledge, and seek collective action. You know, what I didn't touch on in my presentation was that a majority of those partnerships that we have are not just between us, civil society, and government entities, but also there's more depth on the industry side. So I gave you the example of PepsiCo and the water policy work together with Nestle and others. The same thing happens in Tom's, the partnership we have with Water Health International. It's Coca-Cola and Diageo, which is a big brewer and alcohol firm, as well as some local businesses working together with USAID and the IFC. So the issues are big and they're shared, and so the response has to be. So I don't think that's the place for competitive advantage if your ultimate aim is the sustainability of those supplies. You know, are you head-to-head anywhere on you get water and I don't get water? Well, if it comes to that in some places, then you're in a different situation. But I think at that point, most industry is already out of the equation. I mean, if you get down to, I've got 3 drops, who gets them? You know, basic hydration and sanitation are always going to trump anything else that you want to do.
Yeah, I think pretty consistent thoughts I would have on this subject. Again, whether it's NGOs or otherwise, industry associations, again, looking to really try to make it not a competitive advantage type of discussion as much as possible, to make it more collaborative, and I'll say open source as many of the kind of tools and best practices that we come up with as possible. Is anyone familiar with Water Match? It's come out of Arizona State, and so we were very involved in that, which again reaches well beyond our industry. It's again kind of open source, literally publicly matching where there are water needs and where there is water availability. So I think our views on that are pretty similar.
But let me test that just a little bit about whether there's a border that you might not cross. So for example, Greg, you talked a lot about your great training program and the online training program. Is that available for anybody, or is that limited to Koch people? Jocelyn, you talked about the new technologies that you're developing, but you couldn't tell us much about because they're into areas. Presumably there are aspects of how you're managing your company's activities in these areas that are seen as sort of a competitive advantage, or at least one that you would keep confidential. You know, where does that line get drawn?
Yeah, I didn't mean to paint the whole category with that brush. Thanks for the difficult question. But so there's 2 avenues for that. I mean, there's things that we have developed and will do, and Intel and PepsiCo and other businesses are the same, that are very unique to your business. So I talked about our risk model, for instance. Well, it would do me no good to give you my risk model because you have the same water stress. We're sitting here in the same place, but your risk is different than my risk. Just as, you know, me giving you my health data doesn't help you form a strategic response to your own personal health, right? So I'm not trying to be vague here. What I'm trying to say is that when you go through this risk process, it becomes your risk. You want it to become your risk. If it's a shared risk, I don't think that really exists. We share stresses. We're breathing the same air, but the risks in terms of what they do are different. And so there is room and there is a proper place for the integration of what you're doing in this water space with your business. And if you do it that way, it's very powerful because you're not speaking in the abstract and at the 50,000-foot level. You're taking our day-to-day business that everyone's familiar with, the finances, the quality, the volume, and you're marrying it with the realities around water. And that's important because that gives you alignment and really solid and sustained response. And so that makes it really hard to pull that apart and say, well, you can see this, but you can't see that. So to answer your question specifically, yes, there are things that we have built into our programs that make it difficult. So the training program that I have, it is conducted and formatted in a way that it is part of a broader training program. And so there is confidential information, but it is something that we're looking at. We have taken...
We'd be happy to work with you
I'm
on
sure
that
you would, yeah. We have, a couple years ago, taken the majority of the intellectual property that we had, all the data sets, all the shape files, all this harvesting of information, the geospatial and temporal studies that we did that formed the data part of our risk assessment, and we donated all of that to the Water Resources Institute as they began their aqueduct water risk management program. They've since taken that to a whole nother level, but it was something that we felt we had to do because we want the collective action on watershed. And so if we have this type of data, why not share it with an independent, neutral source like WRI or academia?
So we have some aqueduct people in the audience.
Yes.
Just for questions afterwards. Anybody who knows about aqueduct could raise their hands just so people know who is here. Back. Okay, great. Thanks. Jocelyn, I should give you a chance to respond.
Sure. Yeah, and again, I you know, a lot of agreement with Greg. I think as far as our own manufacturing operations go, where we're still figuring things out, that's kind of what's not ready to be shared because it's still pretty early in the proof of concept phase. But I'll give a specific example from supply chain. So we're doing more actually this year in terms of supplier capability building and sustainability than we ever have in the past. We've done a 2-day sustainability summit for our China suppliers that we've held in Shanghai the past couple of years. One thing we're doing there is really trying to pull in other industries as much as possible to share more across different sectors, again, to try to increase the pace of progress and learning. And actually, I just co-authored a white paper with BSR last month, actually, looking for ways to collaborate cross-sector more frequently, whether that's supplier capability building or otherwise, because I do feel like we probably have opportunities where, there's a best practice you guys have figured out that may not be a direct translation, but surely, we can benefit by the work that you've done and hopefully vice versa. So I think we're growing in terms of our real focus in trying to do more, whether you call it open source or cross-sector, public collaboration. Nice. So I think we're trending in that direction.
Great. Yeah, question in the blue.
Hi, my name is Colby Tucker. I'm a master's student here at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Thank you both for your really interesting presentations. The thing that caught me most about your presentations was the juxtaposition between the water use business models and how Koch's is very local and how Intel's uses more of a global source and ships it. And so on one of the slides for you, Greg, you had a grow, protect, and sustain as a motto. And I'm wondering that in the future, as climate change becomes a bigger stress, in order to sustain your mission in reducing your water use and returning water back to the local areas, do you think that you might have to change your business model in order to go to more water-rich areas and avoid those water-poor areas?
Yeah. Two-part answer. One is, I don't know. That's not my purview in terms of changing our business model, because that can't be done single variantly. You can't just say, well, because of the water issues, we're going to move to much how the beer business in the U.S. works. You look at Anheuser-Busch, I think they have 7 or 8 manufacturing facilities around the United States, and then you get your beer from a distributor. They ship it all around the United States, right? So there's a lot of factors that go into creating business models. Is water certainly one of them? Yes. But would it be the main driver for changing a business model? That's above me. I hope to be part of those discussions if it gets to that. But there's a lot of other things in play: transportation, infrastructure, logistics, carbon footprint, or shipping greater distances, what have you. But what I can say is that our source protection program, where the meat of the data and the response to that data comes from, there's a premise to that document. It's an internal requirement. So the actual document that tells our operations what you have to do, not a premise, an introduction, a purpose. And in that purpose, in fact, I wrote it. So I state that it is not the purpose of this document and all this work you have to do and all this training you have to do to ensure you get enough water wherever you want, as much as you want for however long as you want. Words to that effect. It is certainly a document to help you maintain your manufacturing operations and sustain them, but it recognizes limits. It says that this is a shared environment, and therefore there are limits in the physical nature as well as competing uses of that water that may have higher priority. So right there we're acknowledging in the very core of how we communicate and govern this program internally with saying that that's the underlying premise for approaching this. So, but could it change a business model? I don't know.
So maybe I could ask Jocelyn a related question. You're talking about sustaining over time and the impact of climate change and the sort of water-energy nexus. And I gather that some of your thinking about water requirements and water footprinting has been linked to renewable energy credits.
Yes, very
Where did
much
that
so.
come from?
Yeah, very much so. So obviously it takes a lot of electricity to move water around, right? That's a given. And then as we got into some of the deeper analysis in our footprinting and in our strategy, what we really started focusing on was how much water it takes to produce electricity. And so overall, again, focusing on the energy efficiency of our operations, the energy efficiency that our products can ultimately deliver to our end users. When you look at something like a data center, it's all obviously very interconnected, and we do look at it in a very integrated, holistic way. I think that's, in general, that's definitely something that we've kind of shifted to over the past couple of years.
Interesting.
Yep.
Maybe one last question. Sorry to end the, I guess right here.
Hi, my name is Corey Johnson. I'm here at the Forestry School. I have a quick question about the investor perspective. I spent several years at a SRI mutual fund, and I know that in the industry, the Intel roadshows are much appreciated. I'm wondering, and this is a question for both of you, I'm wondering to what degree traditional institutional investors are taking these issues into consideration. Are water issues being talked about on analyst calls, among bigger institutional investors?
I honestly don't know if water specifically has come up, but generally speaking, among not only the SRI, but the traditional investment community, I would say it's been continuously growing over the past several years. So as an example, supply chain has grown as an interest among mainstream investors to the point where we're being pulled into a lot more conversations than we ever have been. So where things might have been limited to asking about our own operations, that's just really grown in scope quite a bit. So whether that's water, labor, obviously a huge concern in the industry at the moment, or again, ethics and governance types of issues. So I think one of the things that's driving the change among more mainstream investors is the addition of the ESG content on Bloomberg, which is just in the past couple of quarters, or late last summer, I guess, mid to late last summer. I was at a really interesting conference in New York last August, and an analyst there was saying that it's really essentially brought the topic of ESG transparency to the forefront of a lot of CEOs' minds that it had not been really even on the radar screen for in the past. Because from a competitive perspective, if your peers got a bunch of good content up there and you've got nothing or very little by comparison, that's really driving a lot of disclosure and I think interest just across the board in terms of mainstream investors.
Greg, do you want to add anything to that?
Absolutely. I mean, 10 years ago, you would only meet with the SRIs, the socially responsible investment groups, on these types of issues. But now, I mean, I've got a meeting April 1st in New York with ClearBridge advisors. I meet with BlackRock. I go to Boston routinely on State Street with lots of different institutional investors. And then, don't forget, I mean, there's some that you might put in the SRI category because they are socially responsible in terms of their investment strategies, but they're big. Think CalPERS, CalSTRS, the two California State employees and teachers pension funds, two of the biggest pension funds in the world. And we routinely engage with them. So it's part of our disclosure in our 10Ks and 10Qs and to investors. So they're asking for it. The SEC is requiring it, and similarly in other financial jurisdictions. And it is becoming more top of mind. It's not something that's purely an SRI field, if you will.
One more example that comes to mind, actually, mainstream investor-wise. About 2.5 years ago, there were a couple of mainstream investors that filed shareholder resolutions with many of the top brands in the electronics industry. Ourselves, Microsoft, Dell, HP, pretty much all had one or two of these filed. And the resolution was specifically asking for us to require our suppliers to publish a GRI-based CSR report. So that was a really interesting one for us, just in terms of the fact that it didn't come from an SRI, it came from, two mainstream investors. And the fact that it was, again, not looking at our own operations, but wanting us to require, because of our, size and scale, require our supply chain to do that increased amount of disclosure. So that was a pretty good one for us.
Yeah, I would just end from my end on an academic note. The work that Dan Estes at Yale has done on performance indicators, the concepts of valuation of a stock or an investment. I want to qualify what I said earlier. A lot of people are talking about this, and it's moved well beyond the SRI community into mainstream investors and buy and sell side analysts. But how do you go about valuing a company? What is the financial analysis that you do? And translating everything we've been talking about and more. So water issues, but carbon issues, others, labor rights, all those ESG type responses into a traditional financial valuation to drive an investment decision, at least from that data set. That's work that still needs to be done. That has not been translated yet. So you can look at how much debt a company has and what their volume is and their operating income and all those types of things. So the next great field is this concept of valuing nature, both from a CapEx standpoint as well as from an OpEx standpoint. And that hopefully will move the needle down the road to the type of disclosure that would reflect that from companies, but then also the decisions that investors would make about that. And I would say ultimately consumers about the products they choose.
And I think things like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index are trying to move in that direction, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of progression and maturity that's still needed.
Well, that's a great challenge with which to leave us. And thank you so much for answering our questions, and congratulations on the progress your companies have made to date, and look forward to the future. Thank you very much.